Hello and welcome to this session in our Outdoor Learning in the Curriculum for Wales course. So this is session 16 and we're going to be looking at undertaking meaningful field trips and looking at ways in which we can plan and design your own field trip. So not a field trip that you're being used an external provider, not residentials. These are curriculum linked activities that you can do and run yourself. So I'm just going to share a PowerPoint with you. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. And what we're going to be looking at is how to make these field trips meaningful so that you are undertaking one which is going to help to either inspire your students to want to explore the topic that you're looking at, or maybe to test concepts and ways in which we can make sure that's integrated fully into your planning so that you're making the best use of that opportunity. Bit of housekeeping first of all, same as usual, please keep your microphones on mute and there will be a recording of this available. So if you get a recording sent to you on WeTransfer, if you do not have a Hub account, then please make sure you do download it because it will run out. If you do lose it for some reason, please just contact me and I'll send it again. We might be using the chat function and we also be using an app. We'll be using WallClap for you to interact with the sessions so that we can see people's opinions on that. And at the end, if we've got time, we might have some breakout rooms so you can talk to other people on the course to see how they're getting on with their field trips at the moment. So the outline of this session, what we're aiming to do is I'm going to go through a process of undertaking a field trip. So what that requires. Now, what we're looking at is one that's probably a whole day, probably requires some transport away from your local learning area, because the last session that we undertook was all about looking at your local learning area. So walking out of your school gates and going within a 30-minute walk from your school in order to undertake outdoor learning. We're going further afield now. This requires some organization. It also requires you to bring in permission forms. So I'm going to go through exactly what is required for you to actually undertake one. I'm going to start with the requirements in terms of the timeline for planning a trip, so the logistics, and when also think about when's best to do it in terms of the curriculum. Is it best at the beginning, middle, or end of a topic? And we're going to say how we can implement it into your planning so that we maximize the impact of that field trip. We're also going to think about ways in which we can offer useful pre-trip activities. So if you're fully integrating your field trip into your planning, you should make sure that you've covered skills or theory or concepts before you go on your trip, so you know that you're making the best use of the time that you've got out there. So I'm going to give you some ideas of activities to upskill so that they've got the prior knowledge and the skills to undertake some popular field trips. And then I'm going to give you some ideas of what to do when you come back. So using that experience and that information that you've done in the field to create some post-field trip activities. I'm also going to go through how to choose the best field trip location and to test certain skills or to cover certain content, what to do when you're on a field trip, and this is all assuming that you are the leader, so what you'd actually do in terms of logistics. This is leading your own and not employing an external provider, so what do you do as the visit leader? I'm also going to go through some activities to do on a field trip, which will cover content, skills, or activities that you can't do in your school grounds. So things that so far we haven't been able to cover. And then finally, if you're not feeling confident or you want to undertake an activity that you don't feel you've got the equipment for, you're not aware of the location, how do you employ an external provider and how do you communicate with them to make sure that their aims are going to meet your aims when you're undertaking a field trip following somebody else, when somebody else is leading it? So those are the aims for today's session. So first of all, we're going to think about what are the benefits of educational visits. And I've got a WallClap here. So I'm going to put this, the WallClap, if you just click on the slide, this should get you to an app. And if you can answer that question, which is what are the benefits of educational visits? If you just type in your responses there, we're going to make a word cloud of what you think are the benefits of educational visits. So these are day visits to the countryside usually, or to a city somewhere not talking about going into buildings, we're talking about the green or the outdoor space. What are the advantages of them? I'm just going to mute this and launch. There's lots of examples that you've put into the Woo Clap app showing the benefits. So I'm going to share that with you, hopefully. So I'm going to do a new share. There, hopefully you should be able to see that now. So let's have a quick look at some of the ones that you've entered for what are the benefits of educational visits. We've got emotional well-being. Yes, so obviously going outside the school grounds is going to provide that, but on a larger scale. You're encouraging reluctant learners who maybe are struggling inside. You've got more space. You can undertake opportunities they've not had access to before, especially if in your school it's a deprived area, or there's a cultural reason why they may not be taken out by their parents on a weekend. Sometimes I get schools that visit quite often from deprived areas who live in Swansea that are very close to the beach, but they just don't take their children to the beach. Either it's a cultural thing or they just don't feel comfortable there. So therefore, you might be exposing them to a location they've never actually been to before. You've also got grounds there. I'm assuming that means that there's locations that you haven't got in your school grounds. So we've got habitats that may not be there, especially true if you've got a school grounds which is restricted in what you have. If you've only got grey space, so you haven't got any greenery, you've only got tarmac, then obviously going beyond your school gates and going on a field trip is going to be a really good experience for your learners. You can also take them to very different examples of areas that they have access to or don't have access to if they're further away. You can look at examples of landscapes. If you're looking at rivers, you can find a river. Doing beaches, you can see that. You can see habitats. Space, there's lots more room, obviously. What else have we got? Opportunities not done before. So again, if they're not going out in these places with their families, this may be the only chance that they're actually going to go and see these locations. And social mobility. Yes, social mobility. You're showing them the opportunities that are available to everybody, especially if they're outdoor free environments. So they don't feel that they can't go because, they don't feel that that's a space that is open to them. And life skills, so many life skills, even if it's just getting ready to go out and staying out in bad weather, but also how to behave in public, when you're in front of the public, what's appropriate behavior. And of course, you can go beyond that and try and teach them things like learning to cross roads, learning to undertake lots of skills like compass work, navigation, timing, sticking to rules, behavior, etc. So there's an awful lot we can do. And on top of that, we've got the things that happen when you're in an outdoor environment, lots of physical activity, and usually lots of team building as well. Excellent. Thank you for that. I'm just going to put you back onto the PowerPoint. So hopefully then you will agree that going on educational visits are a good idea, and you can see the benefits from that Woo Clap. So what we're going to go through now is basically a timetable of how you plan a field trip, starting from when you decide you think it's a good idea to do it. Now, I get a lot of schools that contact me and say, oh, we want to go on a field trip, can we go out next week? Now, unfortunately, that's not the best idea, because the planning involved in a field trip requires you to put an evolve form in, which is required more than 4 weeks before you actually go on your field trip. And really, if you're doing it last minute, you can't therefore interact with the planning you've done and making sure that you're covering what's required before you actually go on site. So you need to consider how you're putting it in when you undertake the planning. And this is the same for all outdoor learning. Obviously, I've talked about this before. Planning is key. If you don't plan it in, then it won't happen, or it won't happen to the best of its ability. So first of all, when you're planning a field trip or thinking about doing a field trip, you really need, at the pre-planning stage, before you even think about any of the logistics, you need to assign a visit leader. So who is in charge of the visit? Now, there is training for visit leaders and educational visit leaders as well. So visit coordinators. So these are all roles. They're specific roles that have been identified by the OEAP, the Outdoor Education and Advice what's the P stand for? People. So these roles have got very key things they must do at certain times, which is legally binding, which is required by the LA. So if you want to know what the role of a visit leader is, it's a great idea to go on some visit leader training run by the OEAP, and they're mainly online now, so you can do them even if your local authority doesn't provide them, which unfortunately quite a few of them don't now. So once you've got your visit leader, even if you're not trained, you can look up what you need to do, look at the guidance from the OEAP, but you've got that role. It's your chance to then bring that forward. But the first stage of choosing the trip and thinking about the trip should be taking place when you are planning your topic. So for example, if you're planning to do a visit or a trip in September for the new term, realistically, there are some things you need to do 4 weeks before the trip. And if you've got the summer holidays within that, you will have to be doing this in the summer term. So that's why when you're topic planning, these trips should be integrated at that point. So this is what you need to do. You need to identify the time in the topic that you want to undertake the field trip. So obviously there's lots of options there, but you need to know really what your aim is before you decide that. Because if you decide that you're trying to launch your topic, you want to say, oh, let's inspire them, let's show them this environment and get them to start thinking about questions so we can do our epic planning, then that's got to be at the start of the field trip, start with the topic, and that means that you then need to plan it probably the term before. If, however, you're thinking about trying to test concepts, for example, then that means that you want to do it at the middle or the end of the topic. And that requires you to have covered certain concepts before you actually do the field trip. So again, that needs to be planned in. You need to know what concepts are covered, and therefore when the planning of the field trip is going to be appropriate. It's no point saying, right, I'm going to test concepts of understanding of the system of a river if you haven't done that in class yet. You also might think, right, the aim of the field trip is to test their understanding of this whole topic. Therefore, the trip is going to be at the end of the topic, and I can then test if they've got an understanding and revisit it if they haven't before we move on to another one. When you're thinking about picking your field trip, see if you can involve your learners in that as well, especially if you're doing a lot of pupil voice when you're doing your planning and you're getting them to, based on a launch day, come up with questions. Try and prompt them to think about places they could also find out the answers, and going broader than your school grounds and your local learning area. So just give them some ideas of places we could go for a field trip when they're doing that planning as well. Once you've got some ideas of the theme, what the aim is of it, whenabouts in the timetable you're doing it, you need to think about a location. And that location is key to think about other aspects you may have to put in. Logistics, probably you need to book a bus once you've found the location. If it's a beach and you want to do something on the beach, you need to consider things like tides. If you're doing things like river, you need to think about access. How are you going to get to the start? Where do you want to be picked up? Thinking about what will fit in the time scale that you've got. Then from that, you should be able to identify provisional dates. Now, these are provisional because, of course, things happen, but you need to get something so that you know it will actually happen. If you don't have a provisional date, then it probably won't go into the diary at any point. Once you've got those ideas, then think about what prior content you need to cover before the field trip, or what skills they need or would be really advantageous for them to be taught before you go on the field trip, so that you can put them into your planning as well. And then if you decide that based on your aims of the field trip, you feel you're not confident in undertaking the field trip as the visit leader, or you require extra equipment or extra external help or provision, if you think it's too dangerous, you can then think about finding an external provider of field trips, and you can provisionally book them now. So that means that at the beginning of every topic, before you launch the topic, while you're planning it, that's when you're booking a provisional a field trip, either with an external provider or with yourselves, ready for when the planning gets placed. When we start to have that provisional date in the diary, We're now looking at the logistics of actually getting all the information we require and all the logistics in place before the day to make sure it runs smoothly. So in terms of timetabling, 4+ weeks ahead, it can be before that, but at least 4 weeks ahead of your field trip, you do need to complete an Evolve form. So online, if you haven't done Evolve training, you need to get that done as well, but that's something that somebody in your school should have done. And that means that you are uploading your plan to the local authority. The local authority will come back and say if there's a problem. To be honest, majority of the time, nothing happens and it just gets accepted. So that will start to get you to understand what is required as well in terms of the logistics, because they will ask you certain questions. Have you done this? Have you done that? If you follow the form online, you will start to work out the systems of what needs to be put in place. You also need to make sure that you put it into the calendar so it doesn't clash with anything else. And if your calendar at school gets very, very full very quickly in this term, you might want to put it into the calendar earlier. So you might be thinking this is way more than 4 weeks ahead, because your school may have policies of you must have booked in more than 3 months in advance. A lot of schools do now. You also need to book the coach. Again, you can do it earlier, but the very latest 4 weeks before. And for that, you need to have identified your drop-off and your pickup spots and the times in which you'd like to be picked up. Unfortunately, coaches are the huge, big bugbear of every field trip. They are very, very tight on times and they're getting worse. Chances are they will probably pick you up after they've done a school run. So it may not be that they leave your school with your kids on board until after 9:30. If it takes half an hour to get to your site, then that's another half an hour. You won't get on site till 10 o'clock. They usually want to leave. Nowadays, they're saying about 1:30. If you're lucky, 2 o'clock to 1:30. So you need to know those times and get that clarified with the coach people before you plan what you're going to do, so you don't plan too much and end up running out of time. Or especially if you've got a walk involved, you don't have enough time to get from A to the drop-off point to the pickup point before you actually need to be picked up. At this point, you should write letters to your parents. So the best thing to ask them for, obviously informing them that you're going on this trip, but also ask if any of them can help, because the more helpers you have, the better and the smoother the day will run. And it is a fantastic opportunity to share with your stakeholders what you are doing to inspire your learners and to provide them with a really immersive, exciting curriculum. You also are covering ratios. So if you've got specific ratios which have been put in place by the local authority, there isn't specific ratios done by any government. So there is your local authority may put your ratios in place. Your school may decide on ratios for certain environments, such as by watersides, but there isn't any official numbers. So you have to make sure that you're following your local authority's rules. And of course, if you're having issues with having parents coming in to help you, you need to allocate staff as well instead. So you need to find out if there's any TAs who are available and who wants to come and what roles they can do. 3 weeks ahead of the trip, really the best thing you can do, especially if you are the leader, is to actually go to the site to risk assess it for yourselves. So you might have been undertaking a risk assessment yourself by visiting it. It might be a local place that you are used to, but you need to think of it in terms of a risk assessment for that activity, for that time of year and for your group. So there are 2 aspects to the risk assessment. One is obviously undertaking the location, a thing, what in the location could affect you, could harm you, your learners and or your adults, but also thinking about the activities you're doing and is it appropriate risk that you're putting them in that environment. Risk assessments done ahead of this, so say this is something you're doing regularly, you're going every term to this location or once a year, risk assessments still need to be updated. So the risk assessment site visit might be really short. You might just look around and see, yeah, no, it hasn't changed much. And then you don't have to do much. You can just check the risk assessment is working. What would be really great is if you could include your learners in it. Obviously, they're not going to come with you to a site rec, but if you can show them photos or you can show them almost images. Street View, Google Street View is a fantastic resource for you to go on a field trip without actually leaving your school grounds, and get them to undertake a risk assessment as you're walking virtually through the site is going to really help for them to visualize those risks. You need to send the permission forms to parents if you haven't done it already, so that you've got that information before you go. It also can identify if you've got any potential problems that you may have to get extra parents in or extra helpers in, or any issues you didn't know about in terms of medical. So if you've got medical issues that might interfere with your timetable, it's really important to know that ahead of time and make sure obviously you've got the medication, but it may be that certain people, if you've got diabetes, they need to eat at certain times. So making sure that's going to fit in with your timetable is useful to find out at that point. Obviously, with the permission forms, you're also asking for money for trips. If you do ask for money for trips, but you can only ask for voluntary contributions. You cannot ask them if they don't pay, they can't come, because that's discriminative. But you also do need to make sure you are covering the cost of the bus. So if you're running it yourself, there's no cost apart from the bus. But if the bus is really expensive, which unfortunately at the moment they are very expensive, you need to make sure that your voluntary contributions are going to cover it. And if you don't work that out from 3 weeks ahead, you need to find out how you're going to cover it. So have you got a petty cash? Do you have a PTA fund that you can dip into to cover the costs? And if not, unfortunately, the trip might not go ahead if enough people haven't volunteered to pay. And although you say that on your letters, that actually can be the case if you haven't looked for an alternative funding stream, either within your budget or with your PTA or your fund, your school fund. 1 week ahead of the trip, we're talking about proper logistics now. So you're going to make sure things like your free school meals, packed lunches have been booked. So you tell your cook, or where you get your free school meals from, that they must have packed lunches that day, so they don't have cooked meals, and they're going to be ready for you and in time for you to leave. And that's really important to talk to your kitchen staff about that. Double check you've got enough staff for the ratios. So based on your risk assessment, including your learners, any special needs that you've got, any mobility issues, any behavioural issues, allocate certain one-to-ones, then work out if you've still got enough ratios to undertake the activities you want to do in the location that you want to. If you haven't, then obviously you need to scramble and find some more staff. Make sure there's a first aider within your group. It doesn't have to be you as a group leader, a visit leader. It could be one of the TAs, but you need to allocate them as the designated first aider and make sure they are trained, they know what they have to do, they know their responsibilities, and of course they have the right first aid kit. Then collect your permission forms, and if you haven't got them, make sure you chase them, because of course you can't go out without them, especially if you've got students who've got special needs in terms of medical. So 48 hours ahead of the trip, so a couple of days before, a really good practice is when you've got parents who are volunteering to come on a field trip, it's a really useful thing to send them a letter to thank them, to inform them, this is what we're going to do, we need you in school at this time, but also to ask them to sign an agreement form. Now, there are some examples of these on the OEAP website, but an agreement form asks them to follow certain behaviours that you would expect by an adult working with children. Now, they may not have to be DBS'd based on the rules for your school, because they're not going to be left alone with the children. But you may want to ask them to not smoke, to not swear, to wear appropriate clothes. You also at this point might want to allocate them a group so they know who they're responsible for, and just make sure they're aware of their roles and responsibilities. So if you say, right, okay, you're in charge of these 6 children, can you make sure that you'll know where they are at all times and you stay with them and you're continuously counting them, and that's your responsibility. That means if you've got 5 members of staff and they've each got those 6 children, all you have to do is say, right, have you all got your 6? You ask the leaders, they go, yes, I've got my 6, I've got my 6, and you know you've got everybody there. And if you don't allocate yourself a group, that's a really good way of delegating, that you know that you've got all people there and everybody is checking on just 6 people, which is a lot easier than one person trying to count 30 children at least. Permission forms at 48 hours, really, we need all those permission forms in, because that's the last thing you want to do on the day of the trip. So phone calls at this point. I've said before about the staff knowing their duties, but just reiterating that, what your expectations are, maybe go through the day. And then we need to think about, is it actually safe to go ahead with the field trip? Now, this requires you to look at the weather, look at your risk assessment, and see whether it's safe to proceed. Any prior looking at weather forecasts than 48 hours, you really can't trust it. Anything more than 5 days ahead, the weather forecast is really not reliable. So 48 hours, you need to look at that weather forecast. What's the forecast for the day? If it's drizzling and it's warm, okay, yeah, we've all got waterproofs. That's okay. That I know they've got waterproofs. I know they'll be motivated. I know there's shelter because we're in the trees. We're going to be all right. If there's one bit of time that's going to be torrential rain, okay, maybe we'll leave later and we'll avoid that. Or maybe we'll make sure that that part we're underneath the trees, but it's warm in the afternoon, so therefore we'll all dry out before we go home, okay? Or, okay, it's wet at 1:30, so we'll make sure we leave before the rain comes in. So that weather will actually change your timetable. So it could be that you've swapped around your activity so that the one with paper happens in the afternoon when it's not raining, and in the morning it's just a look-see and then go into the bushes, and it doesn't matter that it's raining. You also, if you're thinking about certain locations, is it safe in the climate that you've got and the weather you've got coming that next day? Obvious one is rivers. If the river has been increased in height because it's rained constantly for the last 5 days and you've got a high river, you won't be able to go in it safely. So therefore, if your aim is to go and measure the river, you will not be able to undertake your aim. So in those conditions, it's probably best to postpone to when the river level has gone down. Same for the sea. If you're going to go out next to the water and it's high tide and it's really stormy, again, it could be too dangerous to do things on the beach or if you're on a sea wall. At this point, you need to gather your equipment. Hopefully you've already checked to make sure you've got the equipment. You're not suddenly trying to find it. It's just getting it out the cupboard. And if you're going to do any data collecting or if you've got any handouts, you should have developed those when you're doing your planning, but you need to get that ready, put it on clipboards. If it is going to be wet at this point and you still want to undertake some data collecting or you want to use handouts, you need to laminate them. Laminating them in matte laminates will make sure that you can still write on them in pencil. And that means that you're ready and prepared if it does get wet. Then comes the day of the trip. You need to collect your first aid kit. You need to check the medication for all your students and it's there. And then you make sure they've got their performs, obviously. Emergency contact for your school and any phone numbers. Make sure you collect your lunches for free school meals. Ensure that all your adults have the itinerary and they are aware of the risk assessment. They don't necessarily have to read it all, but you need to identify things that they may be exposed to or the learners may be exposed to so that they can keep the learners aware. And also any mitigation measures that you think have been put in place to help keep them safe. So it's like, right, when we're standing next to the seawall, nobody is to climb on it. Can you make sure your learners don't climb on it? And then allocate groups. So you may not have done this already, but it's really useful to actually allocate a group to each of your adults and making sure that they know who's in their group, giving them a list, a class list. Obviously, you'll have a whole class list. And then they can be aware that who they're responsible for. And if they know their group, it's a great opportunity there. Then equipment, load it onto the bus, and then you're off. Right, so that's all you have to do, go on field trip. It looks like a lot, but if you do that and in the right time frame, you will end up having the preparation for a fantastic field trip. And when you plan to have your field trip, obviously the teaching of your topic is really key to what you're going to do on your field trip. So depending on the aims of your trip, you need to have covered certain things. And I'm going to go through some examples of what you might want to do with a field trip. So some aims of a field trip and how that links into what time in the topic teaching you would actually put it into the planning. So for example, if you want to inspire your learners to come up with questions about the topic, so you're basically launching your topic, then obviously your field trip needs to take place at the beginning of the topic and very early on. If you're trying to inspire your learners to be interested in the topic so that they can then refer back to what they learned in following weeks, so you're letting them explore and find out about something, and then you go back to school and you continue with that research, then obviously, again, that needs to be at the beginning of the topic. You can use it to keep them interested in the topic. So say your topic is dragging on a bit and you they're kind of losing their interest. You can reignite their interest by doing a field trip in mid-topic. And that's a lovely way. If you've launched a topic, they're really excited, and then it all kind of starts to go a bit flat. And it's like, right, okay, how can I reinvigorate this topic? Right, let's go on a trip. And then from that, we've got that interest and that excitement again. If your aim is to teach concepts, then use that in the field. So you're testing a concept in the field, then you might want to not have a lot of prior knowledge because you're teaching it in the field. However, if you're testing their understanding of a concept, so you've taught it in class, then obviously you do a field trip after that. So that could be in the middle, or it could be at the end of a topic. You could be using your field trip to move the learners from this theoretical in the classroom to practical application of knowledge. And again, that needs to be undertaken after you've done the teaching of the theoretical. And that could be in the middle of your topic, or it could be at the end of your topic. You could be testing their understanding of concepts. So you've taught them all about plants and how they move, adapt, and how they grow. And then either in the middle of the topic, after you've covered that concept, or at the end of the topic, you then take them out to actually test what they've understood and whether they understood what you taught them in class. It could be that you're trying to bring together all the learnt elements of the topic. So you've taught them a whole load of things about rivers and it's kind of all mixed together. So bringing them at the very end, after you've covered all that theory, all that stuff you've taught, at the end of the topic, bring them out and it brings it all together as a kind of final thing. You might be aiming to bring the learning that they've undertaken to life. So again, after you've actually taught the theory, you need to then take them out, usually best done at the end of a topic. You might want to demonstrate certain processes, so things like erosion, longshore drift, ways in which land use changes. And again, could be in the middle of a topic, but you've got to do the theory first. So that could be in the middle or at the end. And then finally, you might be celebrating the learning that they've undertaken in the topic, and that has to be undertaken really at the end. So from this list, I hope you can see that there is a benefit in undertaking a field trip at the beginning, at the middle, or at the end of the topic, depending on what the aims of the field trip are. So this is why the trip really needs to be planned at the planning stage so that you can see when it is best to insert the trip. And also, if you're booking providers or buses, it can be done in the same time so that the field trip is meaningful. Because if you decide, oh yes, this would be great, I really want to do this to test these understanding, you then contact your external provider and they say, oh, sorry, no, I haven't got any spaces until July. And you're like, well, no, I wanted to use it in the middle of the subject. So making sure you do it early will mean that you can get the place when you actually want it. Unfortunately, because we are doing outdoor learning, there is the potential for a postponement of a field trip, and it is very annoying when you have to postpone. But if it's for safety reasons and including the weather, you may have to change the aims of your field trip. But trips are of value even at the end if you plan them right. You just may have to tweak them a bit. You need to think about what you are going to be doing in terms of the aims, and I'll talk about an example of that a bit later. So preparing your learners, a bit like when we went through last week looking at your local learning area, if you prepare your learners with skills or knowledge before they go on this trip, then you're going to make the best use of the time that you've got out there. unfortunately, because of the school day, unless you want to extend beyond the 3:30 or the 3 o'clock end of school, you will have probably about maximum of 4 hours in the field. So that's not a lot of time. So you really want to make the most use of that. So the best thing to do that is to try and get your learners upskilled before you take them out. So I'm going to go through just some ways in which you can use the learners to learn from the actual planning aspect of the field trip as well. So again, utilizing it as an experience and also utilizing it as an opportunity to learn skills. So these are things you will have to do anyway, but why not include them in the creation or of the logistics of it as well? So these are just generic ones that will happen. You can do it on any field trip at all. So first of all, thinking about how you get to your site. So if you're coming up with a plan and you're thinking about a location, you will have to get there from your school. Now, obviously, the bus driver is going to do that, but why not integrate some route planning, some use of maps, some timetabling, some looking at speed and creating routes on directions like directional language. Use that when you plan the route. So you've decided you're going to go to the beach. This is where your school is. You provide a map. They need to work out the best route. And it's great if you can then add in some difficulties or increased challenge by saying, well, there's a bridge there that's too low for our bus to go through, so we need to go round that. There's always a problem there because there's always a traffic jam. Let's avoid that location. So you can add in a challenge for different learners depending on their age group. The risk assessment aspect, which you must undertake, again, getting your learners to do it with you, especially using Google Street View, will provide them with the opportunity to see where they're going before they go, come up with come up with what they need to actually go there. Great looking for the right equipment, but also great for looking at the right clothes. So thinking about the weather. So if they can produce their own kit list of what they need, so if they look and they see that they're walking quite a long distance and there's nowhere to go to the toilet and there's nowhere to get a drink, then they know they need to go to the toilet before they go. They need to be able to do a wild wee. So that might be something you need to discuss before you go and get them used to that idea. Sometimes it's just an idea that's stopping them going. And then they need to bring water and they need to be mentally prepared for doing a long walk because it's physically demanding. So they need a good night's sleep. So it might be all that you need to instill as well. The timetable for the day of the activities that you're going to undertake. Now, you, of course, are going to be in charge of planning the activities or coming up with a timetable, but giving them the opportunity to add things that they would like to do out in that location as well is a great way of bringing in some student voice. So if you're going to the beach, chances are they probably would like to have some time to build sandcastles or play. So they might then say, right, okay, you know, the aims for the day are to collect data on rockpool animals. So we do that in the morning, we have lunch, then we have half an hour playing football, and then we'll have a sandcastle competition after that. And then you've all contributed to it. They know if they work really hard in the morning collecting their data, which they'll enjoy anyway, they get to have a fun activity in the afternoon, and they know that that's going to happen. So they're prepared. They could bring their buckets and spades and everything as well. Also think about practicing activities that you will actually be undertaking on the field trip. So again, you're upskilling them so that they know how to use the equipment that you're bringing. They understand why they're doing things. And it's also going to be, sorry, I'm just a beamer. So they're also going to be thinking about what they're going to do on the field and why they're doing it on the field. So consider what you're going to do on the day. If you're collecting data, what equipment are you going to use? Could you have a go of that equipment using your school grounds? So if you're using quadrats, for example, or are you using something like a data sheet? Maybe you could practice that in your school grounds. And then when you go on the field, you just give them the sheet and go, there we go, you've done this already. You know how to do it now. It's just a different place. It could be that you give them an opportunity to plan something that they're going to build. So a den If they design that on paper before they go out, when they get there, they can then consider that and use that as a role, as a kind of instructions for how to create their den or a piece of artwork. Also think about the concepts, the skills, or the processes that you can test and or you can undertake outside. So landforms, that's something that's really best done on a field trips. Try and compare it to something you've got in your school grounds. So you're not going to have a river, you're not going to have mountains, but you can try to make a small scale version of it and think about how we can actually identify something in the field when we go on our field trip and how we can compare it to what we've got. We can also look at some skills such as sampling. So sampling is choosing a location where we can identify a trend within a habitat, but we don't count everything. So small area is kind of showing what the rest of the area is like. Following the scientific process, so making sure that they are aware of the scientific process, because you might be undertaking that in the field trip. You also might want to plan it. You might want to do the question, undertake the question, find out variables, come up with the methodology, look at the equipment, create a results table or a data collection sheet. That when you go in the field, you've got all that prior knowledge, and then you can just go straight in to the data collection, and it means you're making the best use of that time. If you're sitting on the beach doing the planning, writing a method, thinking about the predictions, going through that for like half an hour to an hour, that's a quarter of your time spent writing when you could have done that back in class. You can also think about some skills that you can then build on when you go out in the field, such as map work skills. So teaching them how to use compasses in your school grounds, using maps in your school grounds, using keys to identify flowers and plants. Then when you're in the field and you say, right, we're going to use a compass to follow this route to go down following this river to the beach, they'll be like, yep, got this. We've done this in school. I've got a compass. I know how to use it. Or here's a map. We're going to be following this. Oh, yes, I remember how to orientate a map because we did this in school, in the school grounds. Using a key. Okay, we're going to identify these plants or these animals. Here's a key. Oh, yes, I remember how to do this. We follow the answer the question. If it's yes, we go that way. No, we go that way. So it's all skills that are going to make your life easier and your students more present on the day, but also more proactive because they've got those skills already. Getting them to create the data collection sheets and handouts is also really useful. Saves you having to do it, but also they see the meaning behind it as well. And then lastly, a really useful one is, especially if you've got difficult children, is to come up with a class agreement for the rules and behavior on the field trip. Now, this isn't laying down the law and saying you must not do this. It's saying, right, this is the environment we're going to. What do you think would be appropriate behavior? What do we do to keep ourselves safe? You can do it alongside the risk assessment, but once they've gone through this, then you just need to reiterate it when you're out in the field and they've all agreed to it. So it's like, right, well, we've said that you're not allowed to stand right next to the river unless we're going into it. And I've told you 3 times and you've already done that. These are the rules that we decided in class. So you can bring that back when you're actually in the field. I'm now going to go through some actual activities that you could do pre your visit, so pre your field trip, to provide you with some skills that are going to really help you when you're doing specific activities in your field trip. So first of all, data collection. Data collection when you're out in another habitat on a field trip that is not the same as in the location that you've got in your school grounds. So in a woodland, when you haven't got a woodland, on the beach when you haven't got a beach in your school grounds, is really, really useful, especially if you're doing a comparative study. Okay, so what I suggest you do is, if you're planning to do some data collecting, you do almost a pilot study or a dummy run in your school grounds. So if you're measuring plants, you're measuring animals, doesn't matter where you are, as long as you have some plants and some animals, have a go using the methodology in your school grounds. You could be sampling species diversity. So looking at how many different species of plants there are in your school field. For that, you just need a hoop, lie the hoop down, and then you identify how many different species there are. So you're not counting the numbers of blades of grass, please don't do that. And then you're looking at samplings. So you're saying, right, okay, how many times do we need to put the hoop down? How can we make sure we're not all sampling in the same place? So you can go through things like random sampling. How do we put it down randomly? Great way of doing that is to create a grid with 2 tape measures and provide 2 boxes of numbers. 2 people pick up 2 numbers. They then stand along those tape measures in those different places, walk together until they find that coordinate, place the hoop down there. That's a random sampled location. They do it again with another pair of coordinates, and it also gets you to teach coordinates as well. So they can have a go at that, finding out the species diversity of your school field. Then when you go out to your field trip site, you can go to another field, could be just another field, and do the same, or you could compare it to a meadow, a different environment. So you could go to a sand dune system and compare it there. If you want to go to a different, so maybe an aquatic or a marine environment, if you've got a pond and you see what species are in your pond, you could then compare them to a river and do the same data collecting in a river or in a rock pool. And all this data is a repeat of the locational data that you've created in your school grounds. So you're doing a comparative study. And if you've got a forest in your school grounds or an interesting habitat in your school grounds, it is sometimes nice to go to the same habitat, but in a different location to look at the differences there. So if you've got a nice woodland area and it is a deciduous woodland, so it loses all their leaves in wintertime, why not go to a coniferous woodland and look at a comparison there? And a good thing to do in these, apart from looking at different plants and animals in these 2 locations, is looking at the environmental conditions. And that's comparative data that you're creating as well. So we can collect data on temperature of the air, the wind speed, the humidity, how much water's in the air, the soil temperature, light levels, how wet the soil is, how many nutrients there are, and how much water there is in it, or the pH. Now, you might think, like, well, I haven't got all the equipment for that. So this is where you might want to go to either the comp to borrow equipment from the geography department or get your external providers in. But most of these don't require difficult equipment. Air temperature, thermometers, pen thermometers are really cheap. They're only about £6 from Amazon, so they're really useful. Wind meters, again, you can get those cheaply as well. Sometimes they come up in Lidl and Aldi as well. Humidity, slightly more expensive. Soil thermometers, again, certain thermometers like ones that you use for meat, they can go in the soil. Light levels, you can get an app, download that to get light levels. Soil moisture, you just feel it in your hands and then you can feel how moist it is. If you can roll it into a sausage, it's moister. If it just falls apart, then it's not as moist. And soil nutrient levels, you can measure how many nutrients are in a soil with a soil test kit. Again, not expensive. You can get them from B&Q. You can do a dipstick in it to see if the pH is different. Great for using, looking at colors and using ranges of colors to look at different numbers. So some great qualitative data there as well. So all of these are doable in your school grounds before you go, so that when you go onto the field trip, you can really identify, they can understand what they're doing. They've already done it once as a pilot, so you can get a really good data set to compare. I'm going to go through some activities now that you could do before you go out, some specific questions that you could ask that would be a really good comparative study, or a really good way in which you could do some pre-visit work and compare it or repeat it when you're out in the field. First of all, the obvious thing is science investigation. Now, a science investigation, if you're not sure about it, you need to undertake this scientific method. So you need to identify a question, you need to come up with a prediction, some equipment, you need to know the method, so what you're going to do, undertake a pilot study. That's a great thing to do in your school field to test the method that you've chosen. You can then test and upskill yourselves in using the equipment, and you can create a results table so that when you go on the field, you've got the results table that you've used, you've already followed the method, you know what equipment you need, so you're just going to repeat what you did in a different location. So one thing you can do, these are all questions that you could use as an inquiry question for a field trip. So if you're going to a sand dune system, which is the big dunes, the big piles of sand behind the back of the beach, You can ask the question, are plants taller in the sand dunes or in the school field? So that previous slide had a photo of a little boy. He was measuring the height of plants. That was done in the school field. Then he went to the field trip and then went to the sand dunes and did exactly the same sampling method using the same equipment, just in a different location, and measured how tall the plants were in the sand dunes, and then put that onto the results table to compare to the field. Again, you can look at the diversity of plants. So are there more plants or more different types of plants in the school field compared to somewhere else? It could be another field in a different location, or it could be a completely different habitat. So it could be that you're going to a woodland and looking at different plants in the forest floor in a woodland, or it could be you're going to a sand dunes or somewhere else where plants are growing. So you're comparing those two sites. Same, but for mini beasts. And again, good if you can compare the same habitat. So different woods, your school grounds wood on a field trip. If you do have ponds, you can do the same there. If you've got pond in your school grounds, if you do identify what pond animals are there, then compare them to what's in a river when you're on a field trip. If you're looking at habitats which have got a change in location, so thinking about sand dune systems as you get further away from the beach, or rocky shores when you get further away from the sea, we can think about the different plants or animals in different locations. Now, you won't be able to identify them when you're at home in your school grounds, of course, because there's not going to be any animals that are in the rocky shore there or in the sand dunes, but you can practice the process. So you can lay out a tape measure and go 10 meters away from somewhere, and then 10 meters, and then 10 meters, and just count something there. So how many mini beasts? And then when you get to the rocky shore, you lay out the tape measure and you go 10 meters away, this time from the sea, and you count the number of limpets, or something. You can also, if you've got a very different habitat to where you're going, you can do a comparative study. So animals in an aquatic environment, that's a freshwater environment like a pond, are very different from a marine environment like a rocky shore. So you just look at the animals in the pond, maybe do some nice pictures and some annotations, some drawings, and then go to the rocky shore, draw some rocky shore animals, do some annotations, and see how the different animals are adapted to those two different wet environments. And then if you've got woodlands, you can look at trees. I've been through, when we did the maths AOLE, how to measure the heights of trees. If you weren't there for that, then you can look at the Padlet, which says how a whole load of ways to measure trees. But you could measure trees in your school grounds and then go to another woodland and see whether those trees are bigger or smaller. In terms of geography inquiry, again, the geography inquiry process is very similar to the scientific inquiry process. You just have a broader number of questions that you could ask, and you don't always get qualitative data or quantitative data. You may just come up with an idea at the end of it. But again, you can plan this before you go. You can come up with some questionnaires you might want to ask people, some data collection sheets. If you are collecting quantitative data that you're measuring, you might want to do a pilot study in your school grounds just to test the equipment, to have a go, or to do some comparative studies as well. So what great geographical questions are things like, what makes this sense of place? And that could be at your school grounds. You could do a practice run there. So what makes this school as it is? What's it's got about it? So from that, you can measure so many things. You could be looking at emotional mapping. So how the pupils are affected by the school and what they like about it, what they don't like about it. You could do some measurement of things like the weather you've got there, the climate. You could also look at the amount of greenery, the amount of open space, the amount of litter, the environmental quality, how people feel about the way in which people move around spaces. And then again, when you go to another location, it could be a built-up environment, could be a natural environment, you then can do a comparison. So if you've come up with questions to ask yourselves about a place, to think about what it's like, what do you like about living here? What do you like to do here? What's your favorite thing about this place? Then when you go to another place, you could ask members of the public that. And that's a really good skill, because you really have to work on asking the questions that you get the right answer for. So questioning is a very difficult skill to learn. And if you're actually doing it by testing your questionnaire, then it's a really good aspect of geography that you can do. You can also look at changes over time. There's a great tool on Google back in time. So if you go to Google Street View, it's got to be on Google Earth, the downloaded version, not online. You can go back in time, and you can go on Google Street View and go back in time. You can see what places were like. It's got to be on a street or where cars go. You can see what it was like 10, 15, 20 years ago. And then you can come back, go on your field trip today and compare what you found. So you can count how many different types of shops there were. You can count how many cafes there were. You can see how the shop fronts have changed. You can take photos and take them out to the field and then compare them. So you do something prior to that. You'd have to do your back in time bit in school. And then when you get to the site, you can say, right, we can do this actually in person now. We don't have to do it in front of a computer screen. You can also be looking for features. So if you're looking at maps before you go, looking at old maps to think of what used to be there, you then go out on your field trip and see if you can spot them in real life. You can also start thinking about what people think. You can come up with your preconceptions or your class's preconceptions of a location. And the great way of doing that is Googling a location that you're going to go to, finding out what people are saying about it. You can go on TripAdvisor or look at tourist information websites, find out from that the impression the students get, then go out in the field and then ask them the same questions again. Well, what do you think about this place? Online, we found out that it was, the busiest place to try and access because there's really bad roads there. That's what people kept saying on TripAdvisor. Or people were complaining about the car parking. People were saying the view was brilliant. Now we're here. What do we think? Were they right saying the traffic was bad? Were they right saying the view was good? What's different to our perception now we've actually visited? Then you can visit things that are landscape features, and you can do some predictions of that as well. So looking at a river, again, go on Google Earth, you can follow the river. There's a great tool that you can use on OS Maps that you can actually do a fly through down the river valley. You can follow that. And then of course, when you go out on the field, you can actually see where you're walking. Thinking about some data collection you can do, looking at beaches. We've got pebbles on beaches. So thinking about how pebbles are arranged, again, coming up with predictions before you go. Litter as well. If you're looking on a beach, you've got a strand line there where all of the material that's floating, that flotsam and jetsam, actually gets deposited on the beach and stranded there. We could consider what might be there. And then when we get to the beach, we could do an analysis of the litter. Obviously, a litter pick would be great, but also if we work out what's plastic, think about where it's come from. And microclimates. If you've got all that information that you're doing in your school grounds, collecting on climate, which I suggested when we did about the geography AOLE, humanities AOLE. So you're looking at what the temperature's like in your school grounds, the rainfall, the wind speeds, and do that again when you go on a field trip, then you've got a comparative environment, and it's a great way to see the differences between the places. And then we can start to look at big questions like, could you survive in this location you're going on your field trip better than in your school grounds? So you could try and survive in your school grounds, thinking about what food you could have in terms of foraging, building shelters, finding water, everything to do with survival. Then you go out to another location and see whether you can still survive in a different place. In our what matters statement 2 for science and technology, we've of course got the design process. So you can also use that in your field trip. So you could model or create a design before you go of something you might build in the field. This is really useful if you've either got no access to woodland or to loose parts like sticks in your school grounds, so you can go into the woods and do it there. It's also useful if you're trying to increase challenge. So you've got designing your shelter that you're doing quite often in school. So they're all designing a shelter. They're all expecting lots of trees and wood, etc. You then go to the beach and say, there we go, now build your shelter. You can provide them with some sticks, but suddenly they're probably relying on trees to tie the sticks to or lean against, and they're not there. So they create a model based on an open space like a beach. When you get there, they've got a plan, because it does take a lot of time to think about how to build a shelter when you haven't got anything to tie things to. It also gets them to think about the resources they need. So you might bring a finite amount of resources to the beach. So they have to either find extra resources or they have to use it really effectively. You might have to teach them to use some skills like lashing. So that's tying sticks together with string. If they can do that at school, when you get into the field, then they know how to do that to build up their den. Again, think about the location you've got and what skills you could test when you're there. They could plan the sandcastle, and then you could also use that. You could either use that to develop storytelling skills, or you could do that for developing coding skills. Code how you build a sandcastle. They follow that code when they're out in the field. They test their code, they debug it to build the sandcastle. So you might think, well, I've got year sixes, we're going to the beach, I'm going to build a sandcastle. That's not a good use of my time. I'm not, that's not much in terms of progression. They do that in nursery. But if you bring in that aspect of coding, then you are upskilling them. You are actually using their skills in coding to build a sandcastle. They're not just building a sandcastle for no reason apart from it's fun. You can also use things like your river studies, if you're going down a river, to design things like bridges over rivers and thinking about the materials they need to use and how they're designing it to make it strong enough to get people across it. And risk assessment that goes in there as well, your health and well-being. And then we've got the creative process as well, thinking about designing things. Artwork, again, you can do outdoor artwork, all the stuff we've done within the expressive arts that we went through that AOLE, but thinking about a different location. It could be that you've got different plants there. You need to consider if you're using them, if you're allowed to pick them, or if you go in autumn time so that you can use leaves on the ground. See if you can use them to make paints. You can use different textures. You can use crayons to make rubbings, natural materials. You can use foil. You can create natural paint brushes, and you can collect items from your field trip, such as flowers and stones, to actually bring back to school. So you can always do it the other way around. So you're going to the field trip, collecting your items, then bring it back into the school to create your piece of artwork. You also need to consider before you go the materials that you need. So if you've planned your piece of artwork that you're going to do on the beach, what materials do you need to bring to the beach in order to create that piece of art? You can also do a small scale version in the school grounds that you can then do large out in the field. And a really great location for doing large scale artwork is on the beach, especially if you've got a beach where you can go high up, either on a seawall or up on a coast path, and you can see it from above. Really impactful, that. But if you drew it on a small scale in school, maybe on the yard, and then when you get to the field, they know what they're going to do. They're going to upscale it, and then they can create a really nice piece of art. You can also get some inspiration from research that you do online. This picture on the left here is James Brunt, a fantastic artist who does all of his art, temporal art, so it just gets blown away. So he does it all outside. So if you get inspiration from that, so when you go in the field, you can then just crack on and start collecting and creating. You don't have to start, designing again. You're like, okay, what should I do? It's like, nope, we've done all that, got in our heads what we're doing. Now we just need to find the resources and build. Right, choosing your field location. So sometimes it's really obvious where you need to go for your field trip based on your aims, and you just need to find the local one that is accessible and safe. So thinking about what you're studying, if you're doing rivers or the seas or castles, obviously you need to find those things in the location where you're going. It might be that you're looking for habitats that you haven't got in your school grounds. So if you haven't got any ponds or rivers or woodlands or beaches, then that will be the location for it. You may be looking for landforms that you're teaching in your theme and topic as well. So hills, mountains, cliffs, rivers, beaches. Again, you're identifying those on a map. But also think about access for your whole school, your whole class, and how you're going to teach them there. Have you got room for you to muster in one point where you can teach, or you're going to be spread out along a long line, and that way it's very difficult for you to teach them? Also think about where you're being dropped off. If the bus is dropping you off in a location, is there room for you to be safely off the road? Is it in a car park? Is there somewhere that if you're being picked up, you can again muster or sit and wait for your bus if your bus is not on time? Is there a place for the bus to pull in safely? Thinking about all the distractions you might have there. Obviously, there's things you can't predict, but is it right next to a busy road when you plan to give your instructions? Or is there likely to be something that's more distracting than you are, you know, a field full of cows behind you, or people flying their kites? So consider that as well. And those distractions may be good for you to use as a teaching tool, but also think about ways in which you can try and, you know, utilize the location in a different way. So places which have got lots of habitats in is a really good location. A good way of doing this is to use Google Earth to get an idea of what is available in your local area, because again, you don't want to go too far from your school. So aim for no more than an hour's bus ride. And you need to avoid things like low bridges, because if you've got an hour to get there, if you left at 9, you'll get there at 10. If you need to leave at 2, then really you've only got 4 hours for activities, including lunch. And if you're starting and you're ending at different locations, so say you're walking a river, then you have to factor that into the timings, so you don't spend the whole trip just walking, so that you get to your pickup spot in time to be picked up. So think about how and where the bus will drop you off and pick you up. Think about carrying your kit and your lunch. So if you're going a long distance, you need to carry all your kit and your kids need to carry their lunch. But could you have a drop-off point where you can leave the kit, go off, do an activity, come back, eat the lunch, go off? And so a good thing to bring is a tarp, so you can put it on the floor and you can put your stuff on top of it. And then if it's going to be wet, you can cover it up with the tarp. Think about and find out if your bus is going to stay. And if they are going to stay, is that a great opportunity for you to hide from the rain and have lunch on there? And will they let you do that? If the bus isn't going to stay, make sure you get their telephone number in case you want to leave early, or in case they don't turn up. I had a nightmare the other day when I'd said to the bus driver that to pick this up from the Heritage Centre. And he said, yes. I said, yeah, pick up the Heritage Centre. And he was like, right, we must leave at 1:45. We have to be there. So we got there racing as fast as we could to get there on time. There was no sign. And I suddenly thought, well, maybe he's gone to the wrong place. And we realized that he'd gone to another pickup point and we didn't have his phone number. So luckily we phoned the pub, which the car park was owned by, and somebody in the pub went outside to talk to the bus driver and tell him to come around and pick us up. Oh, it was a nightmare. So lesson learned, make sure you have your bus's telephone number. Also have a plan B location. So if your site is not appropriate, so it shouldn't really be an issue if you've planned ahead and you've been there and you've had a look, but on the day it may be that you have to relocate. Say there's another group there and there's not enough room, or you think that it's unsafe because there's members of the public there hanging around that you don't like the look of. And realistically, to undertake this kind of dynamic risk assessment, you need really a risk management plan. So that means you've thought about these possibilities. So within your risk assessment, if you have well, what happens if? So what happens if we're walking along our route, along the river, somebody sprains their ankle? What's our nearest escape route? How do we get to see the bus? How do we make sure that we've got enough members of staff, so if somebody has to go with somebody to hospital, we've still got enough to get to the bus? So for that, you always need to do a site rec, so a reconnoiter, and make sure you know you have your aims and your learning objectives in mind when you visit, so you can plan what activities to do where, and you know where you're going to have your muster points, where your lunch spot's going to be, where your toilet's going to be, where you can wash your hands, as well as undertaking your risk assessment. So that site rec is vital to making sure everything goes smoothly. So what you do actually when you're on site, your actual field trip, this is just an idea of a timetable of a field trip. So 9 o'clock, pre-visit checks, and then get all your students on the bus. 9:30 on the bus, so en route, you're going to brief the staff while you're on the bus journey. Just go quickly over the rules and responsibilities, give them an outline for the day. 10 o'clock, you should be arriving on site at the very latest. And then when you get on there, reinforce the rules and expectations to your children before they get off the bus. Exit the bus at 10 past, get their bags, move to where they're going to start. If they're going to be carrying bags for a while, then they need to go for the toilet there if there's a possibility. If they're going to a location where they can put their bags down, then go walk to where you're going to put your bags down on the tarp and put them down on the tarp. Then I suggest you start with some kind of transition exercise if you don't have to get from A to B, something to get over the bus, even if it's just a walk through a car park or through a sand dunes to get to the beach. That usually calms them down, gives them an opportunity to observe, have a look at all the distractions. You may want to give them the run around if they've really not had a good time on the bus, or you feel that your class needs a running around activity. Sometimes they do a game to start off to get them in the mood, but also to wake them up a bit. Then 10:45, start your first activity, whatever that is. Then you've got a break for snack if you feel they need it. Again, you know your learners, they will be asking you for a snack as almost exactly the same time as they have snack in school. Their timetable is perfect, so you might want to make sure you've got that in your timetable. After the snack, second activity. Lunchtime, whenever you have lunchtime in school, usually, because again, they'll be starving. Wash hands for toilets, so if you can have a lunch spot close to the toilets, that's really useful. Lunch, only give them half an hour max for lunch. They are eating at lunchtime. If you want to give them playtime, give them that after lunch once everyone's, especially on the beach, there's no sand going to be flying everywhere. So think about lunch as being much shorter than at school. You're not going to have an hour's lunch break. Otherwise, again, that's a quarter of your time used out in the field. Playtime, let them blow off a bit of steam. Also play in the environment they're at. It's really useful, especially if they don't get to go there. Then you'll do a last activity, which usually is much shorter than the others because timing wise, but do leave time at the end to have a plenary, find out what they found out, what they enjoyed, try and get some feedback from them, quick toilet trip before you get back on your bus with all your kit. So that is an outline for a day. So as you can see, there's not a lot of free time put into there. And if your aim of your day is for them to experience the outdoors and to enjoy it and to have some health and well-being, you might want to structure it in a way where you've got much shorter activities and much longer downtime there. So again, it all depends on your learners. So the activities that you are undertaking are going to depend on the aims of your trip. So make sure you're thinking about the timing when you're planning it. So if you're doing rock pooling, for example, the tide is only out far enough in the afternoon, then that session is going to be really short. So you've got to think about the instructions. Maybe you're giving instructions before that, or maybe you're choosing a different day. And also aim to get most of the really important talking and the important activities done in the morning, because in the afternoon, you really want a less taxing and quite a freer activity, because they're usually quite tired but excitable, and things like building and being creative always work better after lunch. Now, if your learners have never been to this location before, such as the beach, then when you get to the beach, if you suddenly find this out, you may decide that the activities you decide in the afternoon, they don't need to do that. They just need to play. So just make sure you've got equipment for that potential possibility. So buckets, spades, balls, etc. Because it does seem a shame sometimes when you're taking learners out to an environment they've never been to, and you're determined to get them to be working the whole time, which is, observing things, writing things down, collecting data, doing activities, when sometimes they just need some free time to actually explore and enjoy being in that environment. Now, I'm now going to go through what you could actually do in those sessions. So what activities you could do in the field. Now, many of the activities that I've outlined last week in the using your local learning area can be undertaken further afield. So you can go on a bus and go somewhere else to do those. But I'm actually going to go through some site-specific activities to do in a variety of locations. But don't forget that the learners also need time to just observe and experience the location. So don't try and fit in too many really focused activities. There's some lovely ones for just observing. So things like sketching, exploring, searching, collecting, they're all great activities to do in a new environment. And if you run out of things to do, then just exploring and just looking and feeling, and all those activities that require you no equipment at all, just to be there, are great to intersperse with some of these more in-depth activities. So geography ones, humanities, we got mapping. So you can learn how to orientate a map, follow a map. And a great way to do that, especially if you upskilled them before you go out, is you set up a treasure trail. If you're running the field trip, you may have to do an activity, or somebody runs an activity while you set up the trail, or you can use something that you know is there as your treasure trail, such as geocaching. So if you know a geocache is going to be there, then you'll know there's treasure at the end. And if you think there probably won't be enough treasure for them, you can always bring a bag of treasure with you to supplement the geocache. You can obviously look at grid references, so they can actually see the map and then go to the grid reference and stand in the right place. So get them moving, don't get them all sitting down for too long. You can get them to draw maps, especially if you've got sand. You can build 3D maps of treasure islands and then draw a picture of it and use different code names for things and use inspiration from the environment to make their maps. You can measure distances. That's a great for estimating, especially if you're doing long distance walks. You walk it and then they estimate how far they've gone, and then they can measure it on the map. On the beach, so many activities you can do on the beach. Great location for a field trip. And you don't have to be doing the beach as your topic in order to do these. A lot of them are great for just adaptation. And the adaptation of rocky shore animals are the most obvious adaptations. River and pond adaptations are a bit more nuanced. They're not quite as obvious. So for younger children, if you're doing adaptation and looking at different animals, then the rocky shore is a really good place to go. If you're on the beach, you basically have 4 different habitats you can explore, which makes it really effective place to go. So you've got the strand line, which is where the material gets left behind when the tide comes in. And be careful there, just careful for safety, especially if you've got potential for things like needles or dog mess. So make sure they've done the risk assessment and you've told them the risk assessment and what they must and mustn't pick up. You can then collect things in buckets and they can sort them. So you can look at some sorting activities for mass and numeracy. They can identify them using keys. They can try and make up a story of how these things got there. They can make artwork out of them. They can create lovely junk artwork on using natural materials. So there's so much you can do with the strand line. And that's a great one to do if the tide is in and you can't get to the rocky shore. So if your rocky shore date is high tide when you arrive, low tide after lunch, or it's going out after lunch, then strand line in the morning is a good idea. After lunch, we do the rock pooling. But don't forget the sandy shore. So in between the strand line and the sea, you've got sand there when the tide's out. And in the sandy shore, you've got so many animals living there. You'll see the signs of them on the surface. So you can track these animals, looking for their snails, trails. Also, you can look for worm casts, and you can dig down to see if you can find the worms that the casts have been made by. Looking for holes. If it's a really super low tide, you can even go hunting for things like razor clams, which is great fun. I've got a video on my YouTube channel if you want to check that out. And again, if you're worried about what to look for in the strand line or the rocky shore, and you don't know about animals and plants, I've got some YouTube channel videos on the whole of the rocky shore. So you can always look at that before you go. So you're a bit upskilled yourself if you're worried about that. And also creating some ID guides that are useful as well. If you've also got water there, you can also think about racing boats. If that's something you've created back at school, you could bring your boats and race them. Just please be aware, if you're making them out of trash or litter, you do take that litter with you. But if you can make them out of natural materials, even better. Corks and toothpicks is a really good way. And you can put paper masts with a kebab stick and you can see if they float off. And then if they float off, it doesn't matter because they're all biodegradable materials. We've got sandcastles, of course, But that doesn't have to be restricted to just sandcastles. You can look at creating models, landforms, especially coastal landforms on the beach. So looking at stacks, stumps, arches, and building those models on the beach and seeing if you can defend them by using rocks, and they can think about what materials would be good. Works brilliantly on an incoming tide if you can actually build them close to the sea before it comes in, and then as the tide comes in they literally get destroyed by the sea. You can see which one survives. It's a great activity there. Depending on the coastline you're at, chances are there will be fossils of some kind, either in the rocks on the beach or in the rocks of the cliff. So looking for fossils is a fantastic thing. Again, identifying the pictures before you go, bringing an ID guide, and then trying to find some. You can do rubbings of them, or you can take photos. The rocks on the sea beach as well, don't forget those are all the possibility of either colors and also rock types, measuring hardness, so you can sort them by hardness. All you need is to have a nail, and then you scrape them, and if it's harder than the nail it goes to one end, and then you start scraping each rock against each one and see which one is harder from one and another, and you create a scale of hardness. You can also sort them in shades, in colors as well, and then use that to create art form as well. Science investigations, again, building on the science investigations I said about doing pre-field trip, looking for species, hunting them, measuring microclimates, looking at rephotography, so taking photos of what places used to be like and then taking photos today, investigating landforms, so doing sketches or taking photos, seeing what you've got in your location that you've investigated back in school. Undertaking surveys. It could be that you're doing it of what's around you, so a land use survey, so numbers of things like benches or bins, or it could be buildings like shops or cafes, but it could be that you're surveying things like flood prevention measures. What's there to stop the sea from breaking the coast? What's there stopping the river from flooding? It could be that you're doing survey of cars, especially in a car park. You can actually tell where they're from by looking at their number plates, and that two letters in the first beginning, that CV for Swansea, will tell you where they come from. So you can tell if they've come from a long way away, and you can actually map the distance they've come, so you can look at some geography of the tourists that are coming there as well. You can also survey the people. You can either do that by not talking to them, by just observing and counting numbers of people, numbers of different types of people. You could also see what they're doing, or you could ask them questions and ask them, what are you doing here? Where have you come from? Why have you come here? You can do pedestrian counts. So that is people going in which direction and what are they doing? And cars, traffic counts. Are they driving towards where you are, the tourist site, or are they driving away? You can survey houses, the type of houses, the size of houses, the material used. And you can also look at people's opinion of the location. So you can ask them why have they come here and what do they think of it now they're here. You can also look at the topography. So looking for hills and shapes of the shape of the land as well, and survey that. Building on a large scale, I've said before about artwork on the beach. But again, you've got all the materials there. You can create 3D sculptures and pieces of art. And of course, this is all transient art. So don't forget to take photos of it, because it will be washed away or destroyed. And it's a great cathartic experience if what you're making actually gets destroyed, because you have to let it go. You can also, if you're in a woodland or on a beach, start to think about building dens and bridges as well, and thinking about the materials you require for that. Lots of locations with wide open spaces and different terrains provide you with opportunities for team building challenges. If you're on the beach, you can do team building challenges, moving water from one place to another using things that are leaky. Great one for that is using rubber gloves with holes in the fingers, and they have to then take water from one bucket or from the sea or from a puddle into another bucket, and they have to squeeze it out of the holes, or using litter to try and move water. Or you can try and get them to move it with cups which have got holes in. Great for really sunny days, great for team building. You can also do things like crossing the river, which you can actually use a real river for. So they've got to put stepping stones in, or work together, or put up a postman's walk. So that's 2 ropes, one at the top, one underneath. So ways in which they have to work together. You can also use it towards the artwork as well. Don't forget to take the opportunity to improve their health and well-being. Now, of course, based on the health and well-being AOLE, we've seen how just going outside will improve the health and well-being. But just sometimes taking some time to not do anything outside will help to bring just the outdoors as a potential for mindfulness or for just taking a bit of time out. So magic spot, going to a location and just sitting and being and just going through all your senses. Forest bathing, so that's going through the woods or lying down in the woods and just being there. Integrate a bit of yoga into your field trip, especially on the beach. Great place for yoga. And I know lots of schools unfortunately say that their children are not allowed in the beach, in the sea when they're on the beach. But sometimes it's a great opportunity, especially if you've got a little river going into the beach, into the sea on the beach, and you can take your shoes and socks off and they can just play in the river. They can just build dams there, and they can just have that feeling of the water going over their feet and cooling them down. And that's a lovely experience for some who've never experienced that. And I would say, if you do have issues with going in the sea, work out what the issue is. If it's a top-down approach that 10 years ago, the old head said you could never go in the sea, or is it something that we could integrate some risk management for? So your pupils come up with the rules, right? You can go in the sea, but not above your knees, or you can't go above your wellies if you go in. Try and say some rules like that, and then maybe you can actually undertake some paddling. Another lovely one to do on the beach as well is barefoot walking. I know it's a bit of a hassle, getting the sand off your feet and then putting your socks and shoes on, but walking along the sand with bare feet is a wonderful thing to do. And if your learners are not going to the beach, then they really should have an opportunity to experience it. Sports, again, if you want to integrate some PE or sports into your day, I've seen lots of schools now actually doing sports day on the beach, which is lovely, because if you've got a great day and you can go off site, bring your whole school, saves on buses because you've squeezed them all into your buses, got a great big space on the sand, and then you can do all your races there. They all have a picnic, and it's a beautiful day usually. You can also create habitats for animals. That could be on the beach, creating rock pools for creatures, or you could create mini beast houses in the woods. But that's a lovely way of actually leaving almost like a legacy after you've left the field. Really important to instill in your students that we're visiting these locations. We need to make sure that when we leave, they're either better than we left them or the same. So please do reinforce things like putting litter away. Don't let litter run away when it's blown away at lunchtime. Making sure you clear up after yourselves. If you've disturbed things like rocks in the river, make sure you put them back. If you disturbed rocks when you're rock pooling, put them back. So instill this sense of ownership, but also respect for the animals that are there. The fact that when we come back, we want to make sure those animals are still here. So we need to make sure that they're comfortable. Then you come back from your field trip, and that's fantastic. But sometimes, unfortunately, children don't always use the opportunity that could have been undertaken after the field trip, because I think some teachers feel they're not sure what to do with what they've undertaken. So these are some ideas of what you could do post-trip, which really builds on that experience you've had. Most schools that I speak to and I say, oh, what are you going to do when you go back? They go, oh, we're going to recount, which is great. But if you're doing 3 trips a year, that's 3 recounts. And every time you go on a field trip, you're doing a recount. It kind of takes away a bit of the glamour from it, because you're always going to be doing a recount. And that means it's kind of a bit boring, and there's so much more you could do. So if you're doing a science investigation that you've planned back at school, so this is properly planned into your planning, planned it in school, did a comparison study in school, pilot study in school, came in the field, collected data in the field, go back to school. You then need to present your data. So you're creating graphs. You then look at your data to see if you can make any sense of it. So that's some data analysis. You may be calculating means or medians or ranges or modes. And then you come to a conclusion. What's the answer to that question, which was the question we came up with before we went on the field trip? And that's a great way of really making the best use of what you've done in the field. Same for a geography inquiry. So we went out, we found out what the perception of pupils of this location was by looking online. We went in the field, we asked people what they thought of it. We looked around, we came up with our own impression and how we liked it. We come back and we say, right, let's look at the difference. Let's make a word cloud of all the words that people said about that location compared to the words we came up with before we went. And let's see whether there's more positive ones about from the people who were there or more positive about the ones who were on TripAdvisor. And then we can say people on TripAdvisor don't like this place as much as the people who are actually on the site. So you're coming to a conclusion, you're kind of rounding it off nicely. If you've drawn any pictures when you've been on site, so if you've drawn pictures of animals that you've seen, if you've drawn artwork that you were there, sketches, come back and annotate them. So add some words to it. So if you've drawn a picture of an animal, a rock pool animal, how is it adapted to live in the rock pools? Annotate its shell, its foot, what it eats. Do some more research to find out more about it and keep adding that to your picture that you drew in the field. So you're building up that stuff you did in the field was all purposeful because now we're going to follow through. We're going to research about it. We're going to find out about the life cycle. And we're going to add that to our picture so we can make a fact file of that animal. You could write a report on the field trip. So say you were looking at the Strand line and you were finding on the Strand line there was lots of rubbish, then you could write a report about what you found. You found so much plastic. We found lots of egg cases from dogfish, so we think it's their breeding season. If you're on the field with iPads, etc., you could also create a film, or you could use the photos that you took on the field trip to make a film. So use iMovies, put those photos together, and then your learners can come up with a commentary of either that's a recount of the day, but it's a bit more interesting than just writing down. And they can say what they did, or they can say what they found, or they can talk about the interesting things that they saw, and they use that as their script for their film. You can, of course, do a recount, but try and inspire them using the photos or any footage you took while they're doing their recount. Don't just say, right, remember what we did yesterday? Write it down. So putting a slideshow of the photos on can help them to recount in a much more effective way. Also, revisiting things you did before your field trip, like your risk assessment. If you came up with a risk assessment with your learners, revisit it, have a look. Did we miss anything? Do we need to add anything? Next year, the next year fives are going to go, what do we need to add to our risk assessment to make sure they're better prepared than we were? It's also a really good idea for you to do that for yourselves as well. If you've seen landforms or historic buildings or some really interesting things in the field, you can come back and create models of them as well to reinforce what you've done. So you're recounting what you did, but in a model form. You can also research. If you find that when you went in the field, you've come up with more questions, especially if it's a launch or a very early field trip at the beginning of a topic, come back and research the questions that you found out. And then last of all, again, a resource that you could create to give to another class who are going to the same location could be something like an identification guide. So you found all these shells, we can sort them into a key and make a guide, and then we can give them to the next class that goes. Or we could write maybe a guide to it. So this is how you explore this location. These are the best bits of it. These are the worst. This is where you shouldn't go. This is where the toilet is. So it could be like a tourist guide, or it could be an ID guide for animals or plants. As the visit leader, there are some post-visit tasks that you should also do, and this should be integrated into the logistics as the role of the visit leader. As I've said, update your risk assessment. Were there things that were missing? Were there things that you should add as some things changed? You also need to evaluate your visit. This is something you should do on Evolve, but it's good to do in school as well, to say what went wrong, what didn't, and then put that with your risk assessment for your location. So when the next group of children and their teacher decide to go to that location, they can pick up that and go, right, well, when Mrs. Jones went last year, they found that this was a really good spot to find crabs. Okay, we'll make sure that we go at low tide and we'll go to that exact location. Also, get some pupil voice in there, ask some feedback from what they thought. Did they enjoy the day? But also what particularly they enjoyed. Was it an activity or was it the location? Would they like to go back again? Is there questions that they found they haven't answered that mean we need to go back there? Is there any way in which the day could have been improved? That kind of thing. So all of that is going to build into like a file that you'll get for each of your locations, so that when you go visit again, you can look at that and go, oh, right, that was a great idea. Somebody thought maybe next time we should bring a skipping rope because we could have done skipping on the beach, or we could have brought buckets because we needed to find some more animals in the rocky shore and we brought trays and it was really difficult to walk on the rocks with our trays. Also, when you come back, just like when you undertake planning with a new curriculum, when you've done a launch day and you come up with questions, if while you're teaching those, suddenly something new comes in, you adjust your planning. Same for that. On your field trip, you may have a fantastic plan of activities, but something incidental might have come up. There may have been a whale washed up, a shark washed up, or some amazing film being filmed down the other end of the beach. And then based on that, your learners may have gone completely off piste and done a complete tangent in what their aims and activities for their day were. So let that happen and then say, right, I need to adjust my planning now. We're not going down the route of the rocky shore. We're going to go down the rocky, we're going to do the sand dunes because nobody liked the rocky shore. They were obsessed with the sand dunes. Right, we're going to go down that way. So let's think about new questions and new interests that arose from the field trip. How do I integrate that into the planning for the next bit? That is why having a field trip mid topic can be really useful, and at the beginning of the topic. The problems I have is when people book field trips with me in the last couple of weeks at the end of July with year sixes, and they say they want to do some data collecting and they want to do this and they want to do a science investigation. And I've had one that came the day before they broke up and they wanted to do data collecting. And then at the end of the session, I thought, I can't tell you what to do at the end because you're all going to comp tomorrow. And it was like, what a shame. You know, we've got all this data. You need to go back to school. You need to do a graphs. You need to evaluate it. You need to do comparative studies. But you can't because tomorrow you're now in comp. So at the end, sometimes it's too late to follow these interests. So unless you're very adaptable in your planning and you think, okay, next term, we're changing the topic, we're going to carry on with this one. I would say beginning mid is probably your best times to do field trips. Last week of the term, unless you're doing a celebration and you just want to, if any interests come up there, you can't really follow them. So just be aware of that. And then using that information, think about how can you build on that experience back at school. So that's not just what have we learnt and how can we build a graph, but it's like, right, they were really good at team building, but they really lacked in communication skills. So right, let's try and integrate some more communication skills. Or right, they really struggled with climbing over stiles. I really think we need to work on some of these, this physical activity. Or maybe I can go for a walk down to the village and then we'll practice that because there's 3 styles between now and then. So think about what went wrong or what went well on your field trip and think, right, how can we build on that and build progression, but also help them to learn from that and get even better using our local learning space and also the school grounds as well. Now, it might be that you decide that going on a field trip that is completely done by yourself, so you are running it, planning it, booking it, getting the bus and doing everything on site as well, all the activities, is beyond you, or you want a bit of a break and you want to spend more time observing your learners and less time running it. And for that reason, you might want to take in the services of an external provider. Now, these are just some external providers. Now, it depends on where you live, where the external providers are. But in using external providers, you have some great advantages in that they usually source all of the equipment. They come up with the activities. They also have the insurance. They usually have a location, so you don't have to worry about all of that. However, there are some problems when you bring in external providers. You really need to make sure that they know your aims and that you have an input into the activities for the day. Now, you might think, oh, it's great, I just have to turn up and they'll just do it. But if you really want to make the best use of this experience, you need to make sure it builds on the experiences they've had in school, in their outdoor learning in class and in their school grounds. And it's covering things that you want to cover in class. So you need to have an agenda, and then you need to make sure that the people who are providing your field trip are following that agenda. Unfortunately, you have a lot of organizations here who have their own agenda, and they may not be looking at the needs of your students, but they might be forcing their agenda on yours. So make sure that you and your staff know your roles and responsibilities, and so does the external provider. So if you want the external provider to teach your learners about adaptation, you need to contact them and say, can you please teach my learners about adaptation? You don't want to ring them up and say, right, can you take us on a field trip, please? And then you go on a field trip and they start talking about resource management, and you're like, it's got nothing to do with what we're doing. So talk to them, communicate with them, and ask them. You need to find out, in terms of safety, who's in charge of it. Is it them as providers, or are you responsible for doing head counting, for making sure they're safe at lunchtime, taking them to the toilet? Who is the teacher? Are they doing all the teaching? Or can you think every now and again, oh, I just want to jump in there because I can link that into what I'm doing in class. I love it when a teacher interrupts me when I'm teaching their class on a field trip and says, oh, remember last week when we were doing that? This is what I mean. And it's like, yes, I'm doing the leading because I've got the expertise here. They're bringing in the context with their learners in mind, because they are the experts in their classroom with their learners. And that team teaching is a brilliant way of running a field trip. Also think about who is leading. Now, chances are the person providing it will be the leader, which means they need to know which way they're going. They're also going to be either at the front, at the back, so logistics like that. But who's in charge of behavior? Are they going to be disciplining your learners, or is that your job? And do you need to know that, so that when they're talking to your learners and your learners are not listening, your job is to make sure they are listening? You need to find that out. What about lunchtime? Who's in charge then? And then what are you going to do? Where are you going to go? They need to tell you that. Handouts. What about them? Are you going to make them yourself? Probably going to be provided by the organization, but really, do you need to see them ahead of time? Thinking about your learners, would you need to see whether they need to be differentiated, if they're appropriate for the age group? So seeing those ahead of time means that you can adapt them if you need to. How many children can they accommodate? And just think about it realistically. I have a lot of schools coming to me saying, oh, I've got 150 children. Can they all come? And I go, well, it's only me. And they say, well, can they all come? And I'm thinking, well, would you try to teach 150 children at the same time? Probably not. So if you've got an organization where one person is going to be leading them, then if you're bringing 60 children and they don't recommend splitting you up, you may want to think, right, okay, we can't teach 60 children effectively with one person. So if I take this 30 over here and we have a game, you can teach that 30, and then the logistics will be fine. But consider, they may say their limit for numbers, and then you can think about how that's going to fit in with your numbers. Or you might want to have a circus of activities where you have a number of staff, your staff doing activities, and an external provider doing another activity. And then you have small groups and you rotate. And that's what you do in school. So try and integrate that into your field trips as well. Also, what's the experience of your external provider with your age group and your needs? So if you've got special needs or if you've got behavioral issues, do they have experience of that? They may be more advanced than your learners are. If they're used to A levels and degree students and you're bringing along year one, will they actually use the appropriate language? And will the activities be proper activities which integrate, which are more practical based, or will they just be standing and talking to your learners, which will not really engage them if they're youngsters? If you can meet ahead of time and have a site visit and chat with the person who's running the session, that's a really valuable thing to do. You are pre-warned as to where you're going, what you're doing, so you know to prepare your students. You also can say, oh, do you think you could do this? I really would like you to cover this. And you know that it's going to be suited for your learners. Is it going to be value for money? So think about the cost and per head, how's that divided by your learners? Can they afford that? Can you afford that? And look at it. What are they doing is what makes it so that you can't do it? So really have confidence in your own abilities. If it's an insurance issue and a location issue, then and an expertise, then yes, external providers are necessary. But if it's stuff that you think you could probably do yourself, then maybe, just try it yourself. Even go and do it with an external provider, see how they run it, and then go, oh, I can do that. Then try it on your own. Just make sure you're covered with your insurance. Ask them what happens in bad weather. Do they have a wet weather plan? Do they postpone it, or do they have shelters? And think about a deposit. If you provide a deposit, do you lose that deposit if you have to postpone for some reason, especially things like COVID? Ask them what prior learning they will expect their learners to have, and if they will provide any follow-up resources, and also what they need to wear. So is there a kit list, what they expect their learners to have on their feet specifically? And also it's really good, especially if you meet them face to face, to ask, is it okay if you intervene and you team teach, so that you can provide opportunities for extending the learning because it's appropriate to certain things they're doing in class. And I can't imagine an external provider saying, no, please don't interrupt me if you want to contribute. I think, that would be a sign of not a good leader, to be honest. If you are worried about the expertise of your external provider and the suitability of them, this badge here, quality badge, this Council for the Learning Outside the Classroom quality badge, is a badge that some external providers can apply for to see if they are expert in taking learning outside, so in outdoor learning. So if you see this quality badge, you know that they have insurance, they have expertise, and they've been over, so that the Council for Learning Outside the Classroom has actually come and assessed them. However, if your organisation doesn't have that, that doesn't mean that they are not a really high standard. So talk to them, find out what they do, look at reviews online, and talk to other teachers from other schools who've been with them to get a recommendation. Right, final thing then, tips and tricks. If you're going on a field trip and you're running it yourself, these were the things that I would definitely say to do or to have just in case. Always bring spare clothes for your learners. So in your bag, I always have an enormous bag with me, and it has in it spare clothes for all of the children. And I don't mean 30 sets. I mean a spare jumper, spare t-shirt, few spare socks. And if it's cold, spare waterproofs. If it's wet, hats, gloves. And so the bag is literally full of it. And remember, if you've got 5 members of staff, that's 5 bags you can fill with spare clothes. You can also, for the older ones, ask them to bring spare clothes, especially spare socks and spare shoes if they're wearing wellies and they're going to get wet on the beach or in the river. Always bring a tarp or shelter. So that's either for your bags to put over your bags, or your bags on top of. If you're in the woods, to put above your heads to eat. That's really useful if it's a very wet day. Always bring waterproofs and sun cream, because we live in Wales and chances are you'll probably need both. And waterproof trousers and tops are really useful to extend the day, because you can stay out much longer if you are fully waterproofed. But just be aware that the person with the worst waterproofs is going to have the worst time. So be aware of how good waterproofs are. Sun cream, get them to bring it themselves, reapply it after lunchtime, have that as part of your plan so that you know that's going to be happening and it's timetabled in. Spare packed lunches. Most people have free school meals, spare lunches, and then their parents of the free school meals children bring lunches as well. But children and adults tend to get much hungrier when they're on field trips. So bring spares and then distribute them out. And sometimes it's nice to have a packet of biscuits just in case, especially if you're doing a long walk as well. always do a site visit. If you're running your own field trip, you cannot go without knowing the site very well. So do always go, and as close to the time you're going as possible and in the same weather conditions. Always bring more staff than you need. So if the ratios say it's 1 to 5 and you've got a class of 30, if you can bring 10 members of staff, then that's fantastic. If this ratios say that it's 1 to 3, and you only bring, and your class of 30, and you only bring 3 members of staff, including yourself, if you're leading, if somebody gets hurt, one of your members of staff is looking after them, you're leading, you've now got you teaching, one member of staff looking after 30 children in a potentially dangerous location. If one person has to take somebody or stay with somebody because they're feeling ill, you've only got 2 members of staff and it's less than 1 to 30. So always have too many members of staff. There's no such thing. Always plan more than you can fit in. I always do this, but it means that if something happens, like some activity doesn't work or it takes less time than you expect, you've got some things to do to fill in the space. And don't forget that these can be things like playing on the beach, exploring, bit of mindfulness, bit of yoga, lying down, collecting, sorting, reflecting. All those are activities that can be in a really nice little bundle, just in case there's the odd 5 minutes. But then on the other side of that, don't try to fit everything in, because it's so easy to try and just work for those 4 hours when you need to stop and smell the roses and enjoy the environment. So take time to just be. And then last of all, give your children an opportunity to explore and enjoy that environment, because again, if your learners are not going to come back, that might be the only chance they actually get to be in that location. Right, we haven't really got enough time for breakout rooms, so we might have to leave those, I'm afraid. But what I want you to think about is think about the field trips you're undertaking at the moment, and also think about any new ideas you might have, things, the way in which you can integrate them into some new topics that you're doing, and maybe hopefully you've got a bit of confidence to actually run your own ones. And I'm going to just leave you with just a bit of homework if you want to do it. You should, or most people are planning now for the next school year, to think about how you could use field trips for embedding the teaching that you're actually planning to do into your planning. So what field trips would go where for you to help? So at the beginning for inspiration, in the middle to re-inspire or to test concepts, at the end to either celebrate or test concepts. Make sure you can do at least one a term, but depending on your funding, of course, how much money your learners have got, I'd say 1 a term would be the least if you possibly can. And just a reminder of resources available. So on my website, you can get the challenge cards there, which you could take on field trips. There's no reason why you can't. I'm just sorting out my subscription service, which will be available hopefully in September, where you can subscribe to Nature Days and then you get a whole load of resources that I've created for doing outdoor learning in your school grounds, on field trips, all over the place, and all curriculum linked and all very adaptable to the new curriculum and the new themes that you're doing. The Padlet, I'll just share the Padlet with you here. Where is the Padlet? Okay, so Padlet is there. Hopefully you can see that. And so if you scroll along the bottom to the very end, there is one on field trips. We've got, this is really useful as a visit leader planning checklist. And there's also some field trip ideas there as well. I might add some more things to that, but have a look at that. And of course, all of the others, all the other sessions that we've done so far, I've also got sessions there. So you can also have a look at those. Back to the PowerPoint. Oh, there's that previous. And yep, next one. And please do fill in the feedback form. That's the QR code on the top right. So if you look at the QR code, if you click on that, you will get a Google Forms. And if you look at the Google Forms and fill it in, that'll be really helpful for me to get feedback for these training sessions, see what needs to be changed, see what I can adapt, what I can add to. And the next session is on this course is looking at progression in outdoor learning, but I'm also doing, of course, every single week this term. And next week, I'm combining the 6 AOLE sessions I did. So 12 hours of training, I'm condensing it into a 2-hour session on outdoor learning, covering all the AOLEs. It's going to be a pretty intense session. So yeah, next Wednesday, I'm covering all 6 AOLEs, ideas. It's just ideas. So not going through the content of the What Matters statement. It's just saying how you can teach all 6 of those AOLEs using the outdoors as a tool for that. So I'm just going to stop sharing. So thank you very much. Oh, just perfect 6 o'clock. If you do want to stop and chat or comment at all, then please do. I'm going to stop filming